My name is Mark, and I moved into my new neighborhood thinking it would be a peaceful place. A quiet street with tall trees lined along the sidewalks and friendly neighbors waving as I drove by, but I was wrong, completely wrong, because the homeowners association had a president who acted like he owned the whole community. He walked around every day with a fake authority aura, like he was patrolling a police district instead of a suburban neighborhood, and everybody called him Officer Ray even. Though he was not an officer, not even close, he was just a man with a cheap badge he bought online and a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt that connected to absolutely no one. He treated the HOA like it was a personal police department, and every resident was under his watchful eye, waiting for any small violation so he could slam them with a notice or a warning, or worse, a personal lecture. That day I moved in, he was already at my driveway, staring at my moving truck like I had committed a crime. He walked up slowly, hands on his hips, chest puffed out like a rooster declaring territory, and he said, "Resident, state your business in this area," like he truly expected me to pull out identification or recite a report. I told him I was the new homeowner, and he nodded like he was approving an immigration request. Then he asked for my ID. Not to confirm the purchase of the house, but to check if I belonged here, according to community standards. Whatever that meant, I told him I was not giving him anything, and he squinted at me like he was scanning my soul with imaginary X-ray glasses. The neighbors watched from their windows, but nobody intervened. They were used to his nonsense. They surrendered to his fake authority long ago. But I was not about to surrender on day one. Later that evening, I found a bright yellow slip on my door marked HOA violation, property inspection. Pending mandatory compliance meeting scheduled to follow. I had barely finished unpacking a single room, but apparently I had already broken some unwritten, ultra-strict code Officer Ray made up himself. I crumpled the paper and tossed it inside, thinking this was just an overzealous HOA guy wanting attention, but oh no, it was just the beginning, because this man took his role to another level entirely, and he patrolled the neighborhood day and night, shining flashlights into yards, taking pictures of cars, measuring lawn height with a ruler, and stopping residents on the sidewalk to ask where they were going like he was conducting traffic enforcement. He tried to ignore him, but the next morning, I woke up to banging on my door. He was standing there holding a clipboard and wearing aviator sunglasses, even though the sun was barely rising. He said, "This is an early morning compliance check. You did not attend your scheduled meeting, and you have unresolved violations." I told him I never got any meeting schedule. He pulled out his little notebook and said that his failure to respond to HOA authority level 1 offense. I asked what level 2 and 3 offenses were, and he said those were classified confidential until necessary. This man had genuinely built a police ranking system entirely inside his head, and he expected everyone to follow. It stayed calm, but inside I was boiling. I told him I would take care of my property, but I would not be following made-up rules that were not in the HOA agreement. He gave me a long stare, then said, "I will be watching you, resident," and walked away slowly, like a villain, leaving a crime scene that did not exist. For the next few days, he followed me constantly. If I went to get groceries, he appeared on the sidewalk, taking notes. If I took out trash, he stood across the street, monitoring the angle of my trash can lid. If I watered my lawn, he told me my hose was too long and could be a trip hazard. He even tried to enforce a curfew, claiming that all residents should be indoors by 9 every night for safety and community harmony, which was nowhere in the actual rule book, but he did not care. Facts never stopped. Officer ratings escalated. When I invited some friends over for a barbecue, they parked outside my house, and we were grilling in the backyard, listening to music, not loud, just normal. But of course, Officer Ray stormed into my yard, holding his fake badge, yelling, "This is an unregistered gathering, unauthorized. Guests have entered the community, and you are disturbing the peace." I told him to leave my property, and he shouted, "Failure to comply, failure to comply." He pulled out his phone, pretending to call backup, even though every neighbor knew he had no backup. The only person who would answer his call was his wife, who also avoided him. His friends laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Ray was dead serious. He walked to my fence and blew a whistle so loud even the dogs started barking, and he said, "This residence is now under HOA lockdown." We all stared at him, speechless. The man had truly lost his mind. I told There was no such rule, and he said he had authority to enact emergency measures. I told him the only emergency here was the nonsense coming out of his mouth at night. I decided enough was enough. I started digging through the actual HOA charter online and printed everything, every guideline, every regulation, every clause. And guess what? None of the things he enforced were real. He was inventing rules, and nobody dared challenge him because he intimidated everyone with his fake police persona. I knew then that I had to expose him, but I also knew he would not make it easy. That same night, I saw lights flashing outside. My window Ray was out patrolling again, wearing a reflective vest, directing imaginary traffic on an empty street. He was talking into his walkie-talkie, saying Patrol Unit 1, reporting all clear. It was pathetic, almost sad, but also dangerous, because a man like that, with a fantasy of authority, could escalate things very quickly. I needed proof, something undeniable, something that would show the whole community exactly who he really was. I came up with a plan. I would record his next encounter and present it to the board, not the fake one in his head, but the real board, the one that rarely met, but still legally existed and had actual authority. I set up a camera near my porch, so anytime he approached, I would have everything documented, and trust me, it did not take long for him to show up. Very next morning, before the sun had fully climbed above the rooftops, I heard his footsteps on the driveway, slow, heavy, determined like a man preparing to issue a warrant. He knocked twice, then stepped back, folding his arms like he was expecting a full confrontation. I opened the door, and he already had his clipboard raised. He said, "Resident, you have been flagged for multiple ongoing violations, including untrimmed foliage, visible trash container, and suspicious nighttime activity." I kept a straight face and asked him to explain the suspicious nighttime activity. He said, "Your living room light was on at 11:32 p.m. That suggests irregular patterns, inconsistent with HOA safety standards." I asked where that was written, and he said, "Classified. HOA officer guidelines, internal use only." I asked, "Who wrote these guidelines?" And he proudly tapped his chest and said, "Commissioned by me, Officer Ray, head of Community Enforcement Division." At that moment, the camera captured everything: the swagger, the fake badge, the ridiculous claims, and the absolute confidence he had in pretending to be some kind of law enforcement officially. Let him keep talking. I asked what his authority actually was, and he launched into a speech about maintaining order, preserving community integrity, and exercising enforcement privileges granted by the position of HOA president. He sounded like he was reading from a police academy script, but with none of the professionalism or training. He believed so deeply in his imaginary rank that he talked for 7 straight minutes, all of which my camera caught beautifully. When he finally finished lecturing me, he said, "Failure to acknowledge my directives will result in escalation and elevated response measures." I asked what elevated response meant. He lifted his walkie-talkie dramatically and said, "Backup requests, emergency citations, and if needed, community restraint protocol," whatever that meant. I nodded like I understood and told him to have a nice day. He walked away satisfied, as if he had successfully completed a mission. Later that afternoon, I went door to door showing the footage to neighbors, and their reactions were exactly what I expected: shock, disbelief, and relief that someone finally caught him acting like this. Many of them had their own stories of Ray confronting their children, stopping their guests, interrogating delivery drivers, and even trying to direct traffic at the school drop-off lane. He had been out of control for months, but nobody had evidence until now. The neighbors suggested I present everything to the HOA board, the real board, not the fantasy version in his notebook. So we arranged a meeting for the following Friday, and everyone agreed to attend, because they were tired of Officer Ray and his imaginary police force ruling over the neighborhood like a one-man dictatorship. On Friday evening, the community hall filled up with residents, whispering nervously as Ray marched in wearing his vest, sunglasses, and fake badge. He sat at the head of the table, like he was leading a tactical operation. He placed his walkie-talkie on the table and crossed his arms. The board members arrived shortly after, and they looked exhausted, like they already knew this meeting would not be easy. When the room settled, the board chair asked if anyone had concerns to address, and that was my cue. I stood up and said, "Yes, I have something to show everyone." I connected my phone to the projector and played the recording of him at my door. The room was silent except for Ray's voice echoing off the walls as he talked about suspicious nighttime activity, enforcement privileges, and community restraint protocol. The longer the video played, the redder his face became. Some neighbors covered their mouths, others shook their heads. The board members looked horrified. When the video ended, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then the board chair took off her glasses and looked directly at Ray and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" He straightened up like someone accused of treason and said all actions were taken under my authority as head of HOA Enforcement Division. The board chair responded, "There is no HOA Enforcement Division, and there has never been one." Ray, he tried to argue, saying the community needed order and he was providing essential security, but the board shut him down, saying he had overstepped every boundary imaginable and violated multiple HOA regulations by inventing fake departments, fake rules, and fake authority. Refused to back down. He stood up and declared, "I am the only one keeping this community safe. Without me, this place will fall into chaos and disorder." He grabbed his walkie-talkie and shouted into it, "Unit 1, requesting backup, immediate response level 3, emergency." The entire room watched him in disbelief because, as expected, no one answered. He repeated it louder, "Unit 1, requesting backup." Again. Silence filled the hall. Someone in the back finally whispered, "Does he really think someone is coming?" That whisper spread into quiet laughter, not mocking, but shocked disbelief. Ray stood there holding the walkie-talkie, frozen like the world around him had suddenly revealed the truth he refused to accept. Board chair told him he was removed as HOA president, effective immediately, and that the community would hold a formal vote to elect a new one. Ray opened his mouth to argue, but the board told him the decision was final. His imaginary authority had officially collapsed, and everyone knew it. He stormed out of the hall, pushing the doors open like a defeated villain, retreating from a battle only he believed. He fought the neighbor's side in relief. Some even clapped softly. It felt like the first breath of freedom the neighborhood had taken in a long time. But the story was not over, because men like Ray do not give up their fantasies easily. The next morning at 6 a.m., I heard siren noises outside. At first, I thought it was an actual emergency, but when I looked through the blinds, I saw Ray in his driveway, holding a Bluetooth speaker high above his head, blasting police siren sounds. He was wearing a reflective jacket, a helmet, and carrying a flashlight. He was directing non-existent traffic in the middle of a perfectly empty street, yelling, "Move along, this area is under investigation." He waved at invisible cars and tried to stop joggers, accusing them of interfering with an active scene. They looked terrified and hurried away. Neighbors gathered at their windows and shook their heads, some recording the bizarre scene on their phone's board. Sent him an official notice demanding he cease all disruptive behavior, but he ignored it. He believed the board had been corrupted by residents who did not appreciate his leadership. He kept patrolling the neighborhood and shining lights in windows at night, shouting for residents to show identification through their doors. One evening, he even tried to set up a checkpoint using construction cones. He stole from a nearby road, but someone called the police, the real police, and when they arrived, Ray tried to salute them like they were part of his team. The officers were confused and asked what he was doing. He explained he was in charge of community enforcement, and they needed to coordinate with him. The officers exchanged glances, then calmly told him to remove the cones and go inside. He refused, so they had no choice but to escort him back home. While he protested about their failure to respect his rank, the neighborhood was exhausted and frustrated. The board scheduled another meeting to address the escalating situation. But before that day arrived, something unexpected happened. A delivery truck accidentally hit Ray's mailbox, bending it sideways and leaving it barely standing. When Ray found it, he blew his whistle and shouted, "Mailbox vandalism, Class 2 felony, investigation underway." He started questioning everyone on the street, asking where they were between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. Like he was running a criminal investigation. He even pulled out a tape measure and started marking evidence on the sidewalk. The neighbors had finally had enough. Dozens of them gathered around and told him to stop, but he accused them of interfering with an active felony. Seeing one neighbor said, "Ray, it was a delivery truck. We all saw it, but Ray insisted this was a coordinated attack on his authority. The neighbors started arguing loudly until Ray's wife came out and said, "Ray, enough, come inside now." He refused. She walked back in, shaking her head, and everyone slowly dispersed, realizing he was unreachable. Board met the next day and decided to pursue legal action to remove him from any position of influence. They contacted the HOA legal advisor, who said Ray's behavior was grounds for a restraining order, if necessary, but they recommended giving him one final warning delivered formally by the board. So they knocked on his door and handed him the letter. He ripped it in half and said, "This is not recognized by my department." The board tried to explain that he had no department, but he shut the door on them that night. Something unbelievable happened, something that finally changed everything. That night around midnight, a loud crash echoed across the neighborhood, waking almost everyone. I jumped out of bed and looked through my window, and what I saw made my jaw drop. Ray had attempted to pull over a speeding car, except the car was an empty runaway shopping cart rolling down the slope of the street. He had apparently seen the cart drifting in the wind and believed it was a suspicious vehicle fleeing the scene of a crime. He stood in the middle of the road blowing his whistle, waving his arms and yelling, pull over now." But the cart kept rolling and hit the side of his yard fence, making the fence wobble and collapse. Partially, Ray shouted, suspect vehicle crash, requesting immediate backup. He ran to the cart, flipped it over like he was arresting a criminal, and then started zip-typing the wheels together, saying, "You are detained, pending investigation." This is a serious offense. And Evers gathered outside in pajamas, watching him with disbelief. He treated that shopping cart like it was a dangerous fugitive. He kept shouting, "Unit 1 has secured the suspect, but needs assistance." The board members arrived shortly after, still half asleep. They tried to talk to him calmly, explaining that it was just a cart, probably blown by the wind, from the grocery store on the hill. But Ray refused to listen, saying this was a distraction technique created by criminals to test his response time. When the board reminded him he was no longer HOA president, he shouted that the board had been infiltrated by threats to community safety, and they were unfit to let his behavior had officially crossed into a level no one could ignore. The police arrived again, called by several neighbors reporting bizarre activity. The officers saw Ray holding the shopping cart down like it was a dangerous suspect. They approached him. Slowly, one officer said, "Sir, please step away from the cart." Ray responded, "This is a protected scene. Officer, back up and wait for my instructions." The officer tried to explain gently that Ray was not in charge, but Ray insisted he outranked them. Since this was his jurisdiction, the officers shared a familiar look, the same one they gave him last time. One officer approached and said, "Sir, we need you to calm down and step aside." Ray refused. They tried again, telling him he was interfering with actual police work, and if he did not comply, they would have to take further action. That snapped something inside him. He shouted, "You have no authority here. This is my neighborhood, my command, and I will not surrender." My post neighbors were whispering loudly, some recording everything, others shaking their heads. The board members stood behind the officers, tired and frustrated. The police had no choice. They gently restrained him, while he kept yelling about conspiracies, criminals, and compromised authorities. It was not violent, but heartbreaking to see a grown man so lost in his own delusions. They placed him in the squad car slowly, carefully, and took him for evaluation, telling the family he needed medical assessment more than punishment. Everyone watched in silence as the car drove away. The night felt heavy, like the end of something long overdue. For the next few days, the neighborhood was unbelievably peaceful. No whistles, no imaginary patrols, no early morning knockings. The board sent out an official notice saying Ray would be temporarily removed from all community responsibilities and undergo evaluation. Before any decisions were made, residents breathed a long sigh of relief, many saying they had forgotten what a quiet morning felt like. Kids played outside without being stopped for questioning. Delivery drivers came and left without interrogation. People walked their dogs without being accused of trespassing. The entire neighborhood felt lighter, but peace did not last, because 3 days later, Ray came back. His family had brought him home after doctors determined he was stable enough to return. But he was not the same. Ray did not come outside. He did not patrol. He did not blow his whistle. Instead, He stayed inside with his curtains drawn. The yard that he once inspected every hour became overgrown. The house that had the most rigidly measured lawn now looked abandoned. Kids whispered stories about the crazy man who used to pretend he was a cop. Some adults felt bad. Others felt relieved, but everybody kept their distance until one afternoon his wife knocked on my door. She looked exhausted. She said, "Mark, can we talk for a minute?" I invited her in, and she sat heavily on the couch. She said, "I know Ray has been a problem for everyone I know. He took things far too far, but he was not always like this. Something changed over the last year. He retired early from a security guard job, and after that, he felt useless, like he did not matter anymore. Becoming HOA president gave him something to hold on to, something that made him feel important, but he got carried away. He believed he was helping, but he did not see how much it was hurting people," she said. "He was embarrassed by everything that happened, and he did not want to face anyone." Then she asked me something unexpected. She asked, "Can you talk to the board, maybe help them give him one last chance, not as president, just as a resident, maybe help them understand he needs support, not punishment?" He nodded because, despite all the madness, I saw a man who desperately wanted respect and a purpose. Not a villain, just someone lost in a fantasy he created to avoid feeling invisible. I told her I would talk to the board, and she thanked me. Quietly before going home that evening, I called the board members, and we met at the community hall. I explained the situation, telling them about his past, his struggles, and how maybe we could help him find a healthier role in the neighborhood, something harmless that gave him structure without giving him power. After long discussion, the board agreed to a new plan. They would meet with Ray and offer two options. He could join the neighborhood watch group as a volunteer with zero authority, or he could choose to step away from community involvement entirely. But either way, the HOA presidency would remain permanently. Next morning, the board knocked on Ray's door. His wife answered and nodded them in. They sat in the living room, waiting. Ray appeared a few minutes later, looking tired, drained, smaller than the man who once marched around giving orders. He sat quietly. As the board explained their plan, he listened without interrupting, which surprised everyone. They told him he would never be HOA president again, but he could still contribute by joining the volunteer neighborhood watch with a clear structure, supervised and with guidelines. He did not create it first. Ray did not speak. Then he said softly, "I just wanted to keep people safe." His wife put a hand on his shoulder and said, "We know, but now you can help without taking everything on your shoulders." He finally agreed, nodding slowly, saying he just wanted to be useful. Again, neighbors heard about the arrangement and were cautious but supportive. As weeks passed, Ray's behavior changed. He went on peaceful walks. Instead of patrols, he waved politely. Instead of interrogating people, he stopped using his whistle and fake badge. He even joined community cleanup events without giving anyone orders. People slowly approached him again. Some even talked to him. He apologized to a few, explaining he had not been in the right state of mind. They accepted it because they saw he was genuinely trying to be better. Things were finally settling until one unexpected incident tested everything. The unexpected incident happened on a bright Saturday morning when the neighborhood held its annual Family Fun Day. A simple event meant for games, food, and relaxing laughter. Kids ran around with balloons. Parents chatted near the food tables. And for the first time in months, everyone felt normal. Even Ray joined, quietly helping set up chairs under the shade. Without giving a single order, people noticed the change, and some even smiled at him. But just when it seemed like peace had settled into the community, a new problem appeared, one that brought back old fears. A woman named Linda, who had recently moved into the neighborhood, arrived at the event wearing a shirt that said HOA Enforcer. She marched around with a clipboard, watching residents like a hawk. She scolded a kid for spilling juice. She told a family their tent was 2 inches outside the marked zone, and she even tried to shut down the music, claiming it violated noise regulations. People whispered nervously because she acted exactly the way Ray used to, and worse, she kept saying the HOA needed strong leadership, and she was ready to take over if necessary. The board members noticed her behavior and tried to calm her, but she argued loudly, claiming the neighborhood had gotten too soft and rules needed strict enforcement. Ray watched from a distance, and his face tightened. He recognized himself in her actions. The obsessive rule, checking the need for authority, the belief that he alone understood how things should be done. Everyone waited to see what he would do. Would he fall back into his old habits, or would he step up in a better way? Linda then approached a group of kids who were playing with water balloons. She snatched a bucket and said water activities are prohibited without authorization. The children looked confused and some started crying. She announced she was issuing community warnings and writing down names. Parents rushed over furious, telling her to stop, but she refused, insisting she had authority to enforce standards. The moment pushed Ray to walk forward. He approached Linda calmly and said, "You need to stop." She turned sharply and said, "Excuse me, who do you think you are, trying to interfere with official HOA enforcement?" Ray took a deep breath and said, "I used to think the same way you do, but this is not the way to lead." She scoffed and said, "Maybe if you had done your job, this neighborhood would not have become so chaotic." Ray shook his head and said, "This neighborhood does not need someone barking orders. It needs someone who listens, someone who understands. These people are not suspects, they are neighbors." She rolled her eyes and said, "Step aside, you are irrelevant." No. Ray paused, then said, "I may not be HOA president, but I know this HOA, and I know the rules, and you are breaking all of them." She tried to argue, but he raised his voice slightly, not in anger, but in confidence. The first time everyone had seen him speak like this since his breakdown. He said, "We do not make up rules. We do not intimidate children. We do not ruin community events just to feel important." Linda looked stunned and tried to say he was overstepping, but the board members stepped in behind him, saying he was right. She had no authority and needed to stop immediately. The entire crowd stood silently, watching the confrontation. Linda looked around, realizing the community was not on her side, and finally, she stormed off, mumbling about people not appreciating. Structured kids cheered when their water balloons were returned. Parents thanked Ray quietly. Some even patted him on the back, telling him they were proud of how he handled things. He smiled awkwardly, but genuinely. For the first time, it felt like he finally understood how to be part of the neighborhood without controlling it. He sat at a picnic table, watching families laugh and play, and for once, he was not thinking about violations or authority. He was thinking about belonging. He caught my eye from across the field and nodded like he knew he had taken a big step forward. As the day went on, the event became a symbol of healing for the whole community. People felt lighter, freer, and more connected than before. Even the board members looked relieved. They had feared Ray might slip back into old habits, but he proved he had grown beyond them. The sun began to set, and families started packing up kids, chasing the last moments of daylight. The board chair approached me and said that went better than expected. I agreed, and said maybe things were finally turning around, but I had no idea. The biggest twist was still coming later that evening. As I walked home, I saw a police car parked near Ray's house. At first I panicked, thinking maybe he had relapsed. But then I noticed Ray standing with the officers, calmly talking. One officer was smiling, the other nodding, and Ray's wife looked relieved. I approached slowly and heard part of the conversation. The officer said, "We just wanted to thank you for cooperating the other night. Things like that can be tough, and not everyone handles it well, but you did the right thing." Ray nodded, saying he appreciated them being patient with him, and that he was doing better. Now they spoke for a few more minutes. Then the officers left, and Ray turned toward me, looking tired, but peacefully asked if everything was okay. He said yes. They just wanted to check in after what happened that night. I told him I saw what he did today, and that everyone noticed a difference. He gave a small smile and said, "I realized something today. All this time, I thought leadership meant control, but it is really about responsibility, and I did not handle that well before. But I want to do better from now on." I nodded and told him the neighborhood was behind him. Now he seemed relieved, like a weight had lifted from his shoulders. But just when the neighborhood began to settle into this new calm, something happened that once again shook everything and brought a new wave of chaos to our peaceful streets. Something that proved drama never truly disappears in an HOA community. It just waits for the right moment to explode. And that moment was coming faster than any of us expected. The next wave of chaos started on a quiet Wednesday morning when the neighborhood received a sudden message from the HOA board. The message said there would be a mandatory emergency meeting that evening at the community hall. No explanation, just a request that all residents attend. People started whispering and guessing. Something felt strange, something heavy, and by noon rumors were spreading faster than wildfire. Some said a major rule change was coming, others said a neighbor had filed a lawsuit, and a few believed it had something to do with Linda, the self-appointed enforcer, who tried to take over the block party. But none of those theories were correct. The real reason was far more explosive. I arrived at the community hall. That evening the room buzzed with nervous energy. Chairs scraped across the floor. People stood in groups, talking quietly. Every face showed concern, confusion, or curiosity. The board members sat at the front table, shuffling papers with grim expressions. Ray was there too, sitting in the back, quietly observing, not trying to be in charge. No badge, no whistle, no fake authority. Just a man watching closely and learning from a distance. When the clock struck 7, the board chair stood up, tapped the microphone, and the room fell silent. Took a deep breath and said, "We have a serious issue, and the community needs to hear the truth." Everyone leaned forward. The tension was thick. She continued by saying that during a routine financial audit, something alarming had surfaced: irregularities, unexplained expenses, missing funds. Thousands of dollars had disappeared from the HOA account, and the records pointed to one person. Not Ray, not a random resident, but someone none of us expected: the current HOA treasurer, a man named Paul, who had lived in the neighborhood for years. Always quiet, always friendly, never involved in drama. But beneath that calm exterior, something dark had been brewing. The room exploded in whispers. People looked at one another with shock, disbelief, and anger. The board chair raised her hands for silence. She explained that Paul had complete access to the HOA funds and had been funneling money into personal accounts for months, possibly longer. They had evidence, transactions, dates, and digital trails that pointed directly to him. The community was stunned. Paul sat in the front row, his face pale and trembling, his hand shaking as he tried to speak, but no words came out. He finally managed to say, "There must be a mistake." But the board told him the audit had been confirmed by an outside accountant. There was no mistake. This revelation sent ripples of outrage across the room. Neighbors demanded explanations. Some shouted, asking how he could betray everyone, why he would do such a thing, and how much money was gone. Exactly, the board explained. It was over $18,000, money meant for community repairs, events, security, lighting upgrades, and maintenance projects, all drained quietly without anyone noticing. For months, Paul broke down, saying he had financial struggles, medical bills, a failing small business, and he thought he would replace the money before anyone noticed, but he never did, and it spiraled out of control just when the room grew chaotic. Linda burst through the doors. She marched up the aisle, carrying her clipboard again, and shouted, "I knew it. This is why the HOA needs stronger control. Only strict leadership can prevent disasters like this." The entire room groaned. Some rolled their eyes, others sighed loudly. But before she could launch into a full lecture, the board chair told her firmly, "Sit down, you have caused enough disruption." She froze, stunned that someone finally shut her down, and walked reluctantly to a seat. But she glared at everyone like she was preparing to write 100 violations. The shouting continued. The board tried to calm the room, saying they had already filed a formal police report and authorities would handle the situation legally. Paul would be removed from his position immediately and barred from any HOA financial involvement forever. The officers were on their way to speak with him. That very evening, the atmosphere grew heavier as people realized their once peaceful community was now involved in a real legal case, not just fake authority drama like Ray's earlier days, but actual criminal consequences. If on cue, 2 police officers stepped inside the hall. They asked for Paul, and he stood up, shaking from head to toe. They spoke to him quietly, confirmed his identity, and escorted him outside the room. Fell into stunned silence, watching the same officers who once dealt with Ray's imaginary emergencies, now handling a very real crime. Neighbors whispered, saying they could not believe Paul, of all people, would steal from everyone. The shock was deep, the betrayal cut deeper, and the sadness in his eyes showed he knew his life here was over. After the officers left with him, the board chair addressed the room again, saying the HOA would restructure finances, install new oversight rules, and create transparent open books for every resident to review. The community nodded reluctantly, accepting the heavy truth, but before the meeting could end, Linda jumped up again, demanding that she'll be appointed temporary treasurer and maybe even interim HOA president, since she believed she was clearly the most organized leader. People groaned loudly. Someone even said out loud, "Not again," and Ray stood up, slowly walking toward her. Crowd quieted because they sensed something important was about to happen. Ray reached her and said, "Linda, you need to stop before you become exactly what I used to be." She opened her mouth to argue, but he raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to ask her to listen. He said, "Authority is not about control, it is about service, and you are trying to take advantage of a crisis to gain power. That is not leadership, that is desperation." She looked taken aback. The board members nodded, agreeing with him. The whole room watched in surprise, because Ray, the man who once chased a shopping cart like it was a criminal, was now speaking like a true voice of reason. The irony was not lost on any. Woninda sat down frustrated, but silent for once, and the meeting finally ended. Neighbors left the hall buzzing with discussion, some angry, some exhausted, some relieved, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. Again, I walked home with my mind racing, thinking about everything that had happened: the stolen money, the arrest, the shouting, the tension, and Ray's unexpected transformation. But little did I know that the greatest shock was still ahead. Something even more dramatic than the treasurer scandal. Something that would pull me directly into the center of the Chayo's Beck. 'Cause the very next morning, someone slipped an anonymous note under my door, and that note changed everything. The neighborhood was buzzing with tension after everything that happened: the fake fines, the lies, the intimidation, and the whole president getting exposed in front of everyone. But after part 5, the real truth started to unfold, and the community finally saw exactly what kind of person had been running things this whole time, and that truth changed everything forever. Whole president tried to rebuild his image, pretending he was still in charge, walking around like he owned every house, every yard, every rule. But people were done listening. The moment he tried to hand out another fake violation, residents shut their doors in his face. Old neighbors who feared him for years were now openly shaking their heads at him, and the power he had clung to so desperately was slipping through his fingers faster than he could hold on to. Evening, right before sunset, the entire street gathered again, this time without me or my neighbor calling them. Everyone showed up on their own, talking, sharing stories about his years of bullying, about the fines he made up, about the threats he used to keep people quiet. And when they laid everything out, the truth was undeniable. He had abused everyone for too long, and they finally agreed he needed to be removed for good. And this time the neighborhood was united, stronger than ever, and nothing was going to stop them. When the whole president saw the crowd, he tried to walk up confidently, acting like he could still lecture everyone. But the moment he opened his mouth, my neighbor stepped forward, holding official documents printed from state guidelines, real legal forms, outlining exactly how to vote him out. And when the neighbors raised their hands, one by one, he realized he was outnumbered, outmatched, and completely powerless. His voice cracked as he tried to yell, as he tried to threaten, as he tried to cling to his authority. But not a single person stood with him, not one. And when the final vote was counted, he was officially removed, stripped of every ounce of power he ever misused, and the entire neighborhood felt a weight lift instantly, like the air itself finally cleared after years of pressure. But the whole president did not leave quietly. He glared at me with a look so sharp it could cut through steel. He whispered that I ruined everything, that I destroyed him, that I embarrassed him in front of the community. He thought he controlled, and then he turned around and walked toward his house, shaking with anger. But by then, it did not matter, because the community already had a new plan. Me neighbor stepped up as interim leader, promising real transparency, real rules, real fairness, and for the first time since I moved in the neighborhood, actually felt like a community, not a dictatorship. Families stepped outside again, kids played freely without fear, and people smiled at each other instead of worrying about ridiculous violations shoved in their mailboxes for the former Ho president. He packed up quietly a week later, moving out under the cover of night. Unable to face the same neighbors he had tormented for years, he left behind boxes of old papers, evidence of fake fines, and handwritten notes showing just how far he had gone to control everyone. And When we cleaned out the old HOA office, the shocking truth became clear. He had been planning even more extreme measures to keep power, something far worse than what he had already done, and we stopped it just into myth. Final sunset after he left felt different, warm, calm, peaceful, because the neighborhood was finally free from fear, free from intimidation, free from a man who thought he was a cop instead of a community leader. And as I stood outside with my neighbor, we both knew one thing: this place would never return to what it was under him ever again. And that is how it ended, not with chaos, not with shouting, but with unity, with strength, and with a neighborhood that finally stood up to the one person who tried to control everything and failed, because in the end, no fake president, no power-hungry bully can ever win against a community that stands together.